If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com, HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. Another week, another couple of Chassidic stories, Be'ezrat Hashem. But before we begin this week's stories, I want to dedicate this podcast episode to the continued success of our soldiers in battle, wherever they are, the returning of all the hostages, whole, healthy, complete, and alive, Be'ezrat Hashem, the refuah shlema, the full recovery of everyone who's been injured or is sick, the comforting of those that lost loved ones, and the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world, God willing. The first story I have for you is about a chassid of a Rebbe I'd never heard of before, Reb David Tzvi of Neustadt, who is the author of the Sefer Chemdas David, and he was the son of Rav Yechezkel of Kuzimir. Now, the Kuzimir Rebbe was one of the closest chassidim of the Chose of Lublin, of the Seer of Lublin. It was one of the big, I guess we call them superpower Rebbes of all the Rebbes. The Kuzimir is known to be one of the great Rebbes, and this was one of his sons. He had a chassid whose name was Reb Label, and Label was a very wealthy businessman in Poland. The way he made his money is he would buy large plots of forests from the local noblemen who owned the land, and he would cut down the trees and sell them wholesale and make a large fortune. And that way, the noblemen never needed to really do any work. They would simply get paid for land that they owned, and they can make a lot of money. And it gave somebody like Reb Label a chance to make money as well. And Reb Label had been doing this for many years, many decades, and he had many business contacts. And one day there was a deal that came up that was very profitable. There was certain poets who Label was very friendly with. They'd done a lot of business in the past. And he had a forest that had been growing for many years that produced really excellent lumber, fine trees and fine wood. And Label knew that he can make a lot of money if he were to buy this forest and cut down the trees there. But there was no credit to be given. This had to be paid for in cash. And so Label, being fully confident that he could make back all the money, he went and took out a loan for all the cash he needed in order to pay the Poritz, the Polish landowner, for his forest. And he arrived at the mansion of the Poritz with a great deal of cash. It was frightening for him to even travel with so much money, because in those days there was no insurance. There really were no police. If somebody knew that you had that much money and they stole it from you, that was it. But it was a relief for him when he finally showed up at the Poritz's home, and he goes up the large steps and comes in the grand door. And the servant sees Label, who he recognized, and he said, Label, the Poritz is not feeling so well. He's been in bed for a few days now. He said, you can come in though. The Poritz said he'll say hi to you. So Label comes into the room, and indeed, he sees the Poritz laying there in bed, not looking very well. But the Poritz says, Label, don't worry. I'll be fine. I'm going to recover. And then we can have our business deal. Don't worry about it. I promise you. No one else is going to get the deal. It's yours, and I promised it to you. And Label had done a lot of business with this Poritz, so he knew he was a man of his word, and he could trust him. But he didn't want to walk around with all this money, because if he was caught and robbed, there'd be nothing left of him. So he said to the Poritz, would it be okay with you if I left the money in one of your safes here in the mansion? And the Poritz says, yes, of course. He tells the servant, go show him one of the safes and let him put his money there. And so the safe is opened up, and Label puts this huge amount of cash in the safe. And he completely trusted the Poritz. He didn't even ask for a receipt for the money, and he didn't even put his name on it. Nothing. He simply put the cash in the safe. The servant closed the safe. And Label went for a couple of days to where there was a Jewish community. And when he came back, 2 days later, he saw there was chaos in the mansion. The whole family was shocked, and they weren't themselves. And Label says to the servant, what's going on? And the servant had tears in his eyes. He said, "Oh, Label, the master, he passed away." Now Label's heart sunk. He had completely trusted the Poritz. Now the Poritz was gone, and it wasn't long before the Poritz's son had taken over his father's business. And as opposed to his father, who was an honest man and an honest businessman, the son gambled and drank and especially hated Jews. So after the Poritz was buried and things had calmed down a little bit, Label went to the Poritz's son and he said to him, "Your Highness, not long before your father passed away, I left a large amount of money in one of your father's safes for a business deal that I was going to buy a large forest that he owned. And if your honor would be so kind, I would like to please get my money back." And the son said, "Well, show me a receipt with my father's signature on it, in his own handwriting. I would never believe a Jew. You steal money from everyone." And Label says, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't think I would need a signature. Your father and I have done business for decades, and his word was as good as gold. You can ask the servant. He opened the safe for me and put it in there." But the son wasn't interested at all. He called the servant, and he said, "Take this Jew and get him out of here." And he said, "Don't ever let him back in again." Wow, that was quite a blow. Label, who had been such a wealthy Jew for so long, given tzedakah and helped so many people, and was an honest businessman, his money was simply stolen by the Poritz's son, who wouldn't even listen to reason, wouldn't even listen to a witness, nothing. And so Label came back home. And of course, he had a little bit of money, but every business deal that he made with his tiny bit of money completely failed. And before he knew it, he was completely penniless. And it wasn't just that. Label had a daughter that was old enough to be married, and figuring with the family's money, he would be able to find a good quality young Torah scholar to marry his daughter, and he would be able to support the couple for many years to come. But now that he was completely poor, and there wasn't even money to give a dowry for his daughter, no one was interested in marrying her. And so Label's wife said to him, "Why don't you go to our Rebbe, Reb David Tzvi of Neustadt? He's a great tzaddik. For sure he can help you." And maybe because his father was so close with the seer of Lublin, maybe his father taught him some secrets of seeing from one end of the world to the other. Because as everybody knows, the seer of Lublin, which is why he's called the Chose, the seer, had holy vision, and he could see from one end of the world to the other, into the past and into the future. So Label, not having any choice anyhow, he decides to go to Neustadt to see the Rebbe. Now normally he would arrive in a beautiful carriage with 8 horses, but he couldn't even afford a wagon ride to the Rebbe, and so he had no choice but to walk there on foot. And concerned that he would wear out his one pair of shoes, he walked barefoot, carrying his shoes over his shoulder, with his talis and tefillin and a little bit of old bread to keep him alive on the trip. And it took him many days of walking, where he would sleep under a tree by the side of the road, wake up in the morning and daven, and continue walking to the Rebbe. And of course, the whole time that he's walking, he's talking with Hashem. He's saying, "Hashem, it's so unfair what happened, and I don't know what to do, and I need to marry off my daughter. And I also want to have parnasa. I want to have money so I can support my family b'chavod, with honor and respect, and be able to be the gvir again, the person who would support people with tzedakah, and support the community." It's Hashem, this is so hard. It's so hard, and I know exactly where my money is. And I did it from a place of real faith. And then he would sigh. Then he would remind himself, I did it from a place of real faith. I did it from a place of faith in human beings. If I had just held the money and trusted in Hashem, I would still have the money today. And he knew that his tikkun, he knew that his fixing was his trust in Hashem. And now he was coming to the Rebbe for a bracha, a blessing, an eitzah, and advice. And so he finally arrived at the Rebbe, and he has to wait a few days to get into the Rebbe's room. And finally, he's standing in front of the holy Rebbe. He says, "Rebbe, I've never doubted Hashem's justice, because Hashem doesn't punish anyone without a reason. And it's true that I might not be a perfect person, but my daughter, she's sin-free. She never transgressed anything, and she'll make a beautiful wife if I could just find the right young man for her. And Hashem, nobody is interested in a shidduch because I'm completely destitute. I have no money. The Poritz had all my money, and I made a mistake of not trusting in Hashem, and instead trusting in the Poritz, in his servant, and their safe. And now what am I supposed to do? Rebbe, please, you have to help me. Now normally when Label would come to the Rebbe, he was in a good mood. He would tell the Rebbe about all the good things that he was doing with his money, and of course help the Rebbe in his court, in his chatzer. But now the Rebbe was looking at Label, and instead of seeing somebody that was happy and shining, he saw somebody who was suffering and on the verge of breaking. So the Rebbe took out 1 zloty from his pocket, the equivalent of $1. And he says to Label, take this zloty and go on your way. Bracha v'atzlacha, may you be successful in all that you do. And so Label took the money and went to leave. And just as he's about to leave the Rebbe's room, the Rebbe says, Label, come back, come back. He says, give me the zloty, please. So Label gives him the bill of the zloty. And the Rebbe goes and takes out of his pocket 40 groschen, which is like 40 cents. And he says, this should be enough. So Label didn't know what to think about this. Of course, he had faith in the Rebbe. So he'd give him back the zloty. He took the 40 groschen and he started heading out towards the door. He leaves the Rebbe's room. And when he gets out to the courtyard, the shamish, the Rebbe's assistant, he said, Label, come back. The Rebbe wants to see you again. And so Label goes into the Rebbe's room. And the Rebbe says, Label, please give me back the 40 groschen. So Label gives it back to him and he says, Rebbe, what's going on here? And the Rebbe says, here, 10 groschen, that's enough. That's all you'll need. And so the Rebbe hands him a 10 groschen coin. Instead of the 40 that he had, instead of the zloty that he had before. Still doesn't know what's going on. You know, life has not been easy for him. And the Rebbe is being very cryptic. It's not clear what's going on here at all. I mean, why would the Rebbe take away the zloty? Give me so little money? No. But what are you going to do? So, just like he couldn't afford to take a ride there, he can't afford to take a ride back. And for the next few days, he's walking, hour after hour on the road. And after a few days, he hears a Polish voice shout out at him. He says, hey, Jew, come over here. And he sees a group of very simple, illiterate peasants, shepherds that are sitting around a fire. And he goes over to them. And one of them says, listen, a guy was riding by here not so long ago, and he dropped something out of one of his saddlebags. And then the peasant shows Label this beautiful wallet that was bound with gold. And in between each of the partitions in the wallet, there was a banknote. Now Label looked at that and he understood what it was. It was a great deal of money. But apparently these simple peasants who couldn't read had no idea what they were looking at. And so one of them said, hey, Jew, give us a zloty and it's yours. And Label said, I'm sorry, but I don't have a zloty. So one of them said, okay, give us 40 groschen and we'll give you everything. You can have the wallet and all of the nice papers inside. And he says, I'm sorry, I only have 10 groschen. And they were disappointed, the peasants. They said, it's worth much more than 10 groschen. So Label said to them, listen, it's true the wallet is beautiful. It's covered in gold. So why don't you keep the wallet and I'll just take those nice papers inside. So they said, okay, you're right, the wallet's worth much more than these picture papers. And he takes the money and gives them the 10 groschen. And then he continued walking, and it wasn't long before he sees a man on horseback riding quickly, and he flies past Label, who was sitting under a tree. He doesn't even notice a Label is there, but Label can see what's going on. It was clearly a poritz. Now it had been many years at this point since Label had lost his money to the poritz's son. But as soon as he saw this young rider on the horse, he knew exactly who he was. That was the poritz's son who had stolen his money because he wouldn't listen to him, and wouldn't even listen to the servant. And the poritz's son, he arrives at the little fire there, and he sees the peasants threw his wallet into the fire, because when they saw him coming, they were scared of being accused of stealing something, and they ran away quickly. When the poritz saw his wallet in the fire, he quickly pulled it out, and he looked inside for the money, but the money was gone. The peasants were gone. So he figured that they threw his wallet into the fire in order to distract the poritz. The poritz went running after them, looking for his cash. In the meantime, Label continued walking as if nothing happened. And a day or so later, he arrived at home. Now he was so scared to even pull the money out of his backpack that until he arrived at his house, he didn't count the money. When he came back, his wife said, "No, Label, how did it go?" And Label said to his wife and his family, "Well, let's see." He said, "The Rebbe gave me a zloty, and then he took it back, and he gave me 40 groschen, and then he took it back, he gave me 10 groschen, and I met the peasants, and I took the cash, and they kept the wallet, and you won't believe whose money this was. It was the son of the poritz who stole my money. So Label's wife says, no, Label, count the money. We have to see Hashem's hand. And one by one he counts the bills. And it turns out that it was exactly the amount of money that he had left in the poritz's safe several years before. And he sat down on a chair at the table in his house, and he said to his wife, look at the incredible miracle that just happened to us. And he said, but I don't understand. Why did the Rebbe play that game with the money? And then he realized if he had a full zloty, he would have bought the wallet with all the money in it. And when the poritz came and saw the peasants sitting around the fire, they would have pointed to Label and said, he has your wallet. Go get it back from him. But because he only had 10 groschen, he only took the bills, and the peasants had no other option but to agree to sell him the pictured paper to keep the wallet for themselves, so that Label would be able to escape without being caught. And now that he had his money back, he was able to marry off his daughter and support the couple. And of course he went back into business, and Hashem blessed him in all that he did, and he became even wealthier than before. And any time he had a business deal, and he had a lot of cash that he had to keep overnight, he would never put his faith in human beings. He would only put his faith in Hashem, in the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And Baruch Hashem, it was always the right decision. I have another story for you. This is a story that took place several decades ago when the Lubavitcher Rebbe was still alive. There was a Sadegor Chassid whose name was Reb Label, and he was working in B&H Photo in Manhattan. He had a simple job, he had a wife and 2 kids, and he heard there was the opportunity to buy a well-known and very popular kosher bakery in Cleveland. This bakery had been founded in the 50s, and now it was the late 80s, and Reb Label had heard about the bakery, and it was presented to him as a very lucrative business opportunity. And he was ready to buy the bakery, to take out a large loan and take on the ownership. But being a loyal chassid of the Sadegor Rebbe, he didn't want to make a deal until he spoke with the Rebbe first. However, that week the Rebbe was not in town, and he needed to make a deal that week. So he decided, okay, my Rebbe is not there. I'll go to another Rebbe. I'll go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was in Crown Heights. Now, in those days, in order to see the Rebbe, people would get online on Sunday morning for dollars, when the Rebbe would hand out a dollar bill for tzedakah, for charity, and he would give a blessing to whoever was waiting online. So this Reb Label, he took his wife and 2 children, because he figured it'd be a good experience for them, but it took them 5 hours of waiting in line until they reached the Rebbe, and that wasn't easy. As Label got closer to the Rebbe, and he could see the Rebbe's presence, he noticed that people were only standing in front of the Rebbe for a few seconds, and he needed to ask a question. He didn't just have a few seconds, and it reminded him of a story in a midrash about a king who granted everyone in the country the opportunity to request one thing from him. And there was one clever person that, realizing that he wouldn't have enough time to talk with the king, he summarized his entire request in a question, so that when he would be in front of the king, instead of saying, what do you want? This person asked the king a question in order to get an answer back from the king. So Label, he decides he would do the same thing when he came in front of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. When it's finally his turn, and he's standing face to face with the Rebbe, he says to the Rebbe, Rebbe, should I buy the Lax and Mandel Bakery in Cleveland? And the Rebbe looked him in the eye, and he said, why are you asking me? Ask a rabbi in Cleveland. And with that, the family was pushed past the Rebbe to the exit, and Reb Label's wife was really very upset. They stood in line for 5 hours for the Rebbe to give an answer like that. Why are you asking me? Ask a rabbi in Cleveland. But Reb Label, it didn't bother him. He told his wife, we need to have emunat tzadikim, faith in the righteous tzadikim. And if the Rebbe said, ask a rabbi in Cleveland, then for sure there's a reason. And not to despair. So the family decided that instead of going back home to Borough Park, they would visit their bubby, their grandmother who lived in Williamsburg. And Williamsburg is not so far from Crown Heights. They spent a little bit of time visiting their grandmother, and then they were heading back home. And as they're driving, they went on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, which connects Williamsburg to Borough Park. And many times there are people that want to go from one Jewish community to another in Brooklyn. And so they stand at the entrance of the highway, hoping to get a ride with another religious Jew. And they saw there was an older couple standing at the entrance of the highway. And Reb Label says to his wife, "Is it okay if we give them a ride?" And she said, "Sure." So they stopped the car. She got out and moved to the back so that the older gentleman could sit in the front seat next to her husband. And when everyone was sitting down, the older gentleman and his Rebbitzin, they started introducing each other. And the older man sitting next to Reb Label, he says that he's the Clevelander Rebbe and that his family was visiting New York. So Reb Label, his eyes pop open. He's amazed. He says to the Clevelander Rebbe, "I was just by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and I asked him for advice on whether I should buy this bakery in Cleveland. And the Rebbe said, 'Why are you asking me? Ask a rabbi from Cleveland. And you're the Clevelander Rebbe?' So the Rebbe says, 'Okay, which bakery?' He says, 'Lax and Mandel.' And then the Rebbitzin who's sitting in the back, she says, 'Lax and Mandel is owned by my cousin. And let me tell you why it's for sale. My cousin is so sick that he can't manage the bakery anymore. And the bakers are stealing money from him left and right. Now, it's a good business and people buy there, but it's not making any money. Unless you're going to be there and be the baker, don't buy it.' Now, in the story, it doesn't say whether Reb Label actually bought the bakery or not. One thing that he was very impressed with was the Rebbe's vision. Even though his wife had felt that the Rebbe was brushing them aside when he asked his question, in truth, the Rebbe could see much further. The Rebbe could see that the right advice would come from someone else, and that someone else would come from the Clevelander Rebbe's Rebbitzin when they were doing an act of chesed, of kindness, of taking the couple from one part of Brooklyn to the other. And so there are times when we don't understand why Hashem is doing something to us or for us. But one thing we can know is that whatever Hashem is doing, ultimately, it's in order to help us grow and reach our fullest potential. Be'ezrat Hashem, I bless you, and you should bless me back. That we all be successful in our shlichut, we all be successful in our mission, our personal mission as Hashem's creation. And I bless everybody, Be'ezrat Hashem, with parnasa, with livelihood, with money in the bank and no debts, good health, good family, growing in Torah and mitzvot, and serving Hashem b'simcha, Be'ezrat Hashem. Thank you so much for listening, as always, my sweetest friends. Thank you to all of the supporters of the podcast, everyone who sends in a contribution, and the monthly and the yearly contributors. And thank you for listening and for sharing, as always. Thank you again for listening, my sweetest friends. Until next week, take care of yourselves, and sei gesund.
Simba!
I have another podcast called Jewish People and Ideas, and every now and then, when I get around to it, I do an interview with one of the top Jewish thinkers in the world. I recorded a podcast with Dara Horn, a well-known author who wrote a book called People Love Dead Jews. We actually did the interview before October 7th, and just a couple weeks ago, I put it up. So here's a preview of the interview. Dara Horn is an American novelist, essayist, and professor of literature. She holds a PhD in comparative literature in Hebrew and Yiddish from Harvard University. Dara is also the author of 5 novels, and in 2021 released a nonfiction essay collection titled People Love Dead Jews, which was a finalist for the 2021 Kirkus Prize in Nonfiction. I spoke with Dara online about anti-Semitism in America, the Holocaust and Jewish memory, why people love dead Jews and living ones not so much, the state of the American Jewish community, and much more. The title of your book is People Love Dead Jews. What's wrong with living Jews?
Well, so the title of the book is about the sort of role that dead Jews play in a wider non-Jewish world's imagination. And basically what it argues is that this wider non-Jewish world is only comfortable with Jews if Jews have no agency. So that can mean politically impotent or also conveniently dead. So that's sort of the problem with living Jews.
I wanted to talk about why people don't like Jews with agency. I mean,
well, yes,
that was our dream, right? We're persecuted for all of these years. We don't have rights. We're not allowed to have weapons. Now we finally do. And people like the memory of us, and they don't like the living of us.
Yes. I mean, it's a lot easier to like someone who's dead, who's not going to interfere with you and contradict you. And this is a dynamic in a lot of people's lives, right? It's
you're saying it's just human nature.
Relationships with people in your family, and when they've passed away, it's suddenly you have only affection for them, right? Even though you fought with them every day while they were alive, right? It's that's very common. But it's more than just that. It's also that there's this role that Jews play, this very large role in non-Jewish societies' imaginations. And it ultimately is a power dominance situation. And that's sort of what I uncovered behind all of these sort of very well-meaning manifestations of people loving dead Jews. And it was disturbing to realize that was where this was going. And ultimately, the book makes 2 arguments. One is that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And the corollary to that is that living Jews have to erase themselves in order to gain public respect.
Wow, I think you covered everything in that sentence right there.
So now you don't.
I mean, that's amazing.
Now you've got it. So,
well, I do have the book. Here, just to show you, even a hard copy.
Yes, well,
and I don't travel very often, but I went to visit my parents over COVID, and I was so happily sitting there on the plane because I look like a real Jew, and I'm reading this book, and I'm waiting for people's reactions. Nobody looked at me, though. I was waiting for people to come over and say something.
That's funny. I had someone who interviewed me about this book who said, I love reading this book on the train, because when I read this book on the train, no one sits next to me on the train.
That's what I was hoping for, but it didn't happen.
Well, people are assigned the seats on the plane, so they have fewer options of avoiding you, right? But
so you have a quote that I had mistaken the enormous public interest in past Jewish suffering for respect for living Jews, but I was mistaken.
Yeah, I was very wrong about that.
Why did you think that, and how were you mistaken?
So this goes into this sort of whole story about how I unpacked all of this. So in some cases, this is about Holocaust commemoration, but it's really about any kind of sort of Jewish communities that don't exist anymore. Because, I mean, I've seen this everywhere from Spain to China and also here where I live in the United States. I made this mistake because I was growing up. I'm 46 years old. So I was, when I was a child I live in New Jersey where I grew up. And in the 80s and 90s, this was sort of real heyday of like Holocaust remembrance events in the United States. This was when they built this giant museum in Washington, D.C. It was like the movie Schindler's List. It was sort of the beginning of this like outpouring of books about the Holocaust that were starting to be assigned in schools. There was like This was the time when a lot of states started mandating Holocaust education in schools. I mean, this was sort of the first time they'd ever taught anything in public schools about Jews. So it was sort of like, that's a win, right? I mean, that sort of, felt like that's a good thing.
Right.
And, or like any kind of conversation in public life about Jewish communities. And so that sort of felt like a good thing. And what I'm arguing in the book is not that these people who are propagating Holocaust commemoration or anything like that were doing this by any kind of negative motives. But what I eventually realized was that there's this unspoken assumptions that are built into that, and really there's really perverse motives that are not the fault of the people who are doing this, but it's sort of part of the cultural fabric of this non-Jewish society of what they expect a story about Jews to be about. Mm-hmm. And it has to eliminate agency for Jews. And it took me a long time to understand that. And I mean, yeah, I can tell you sort of the story of like how I came to this realization over, several years in the process of writing this book. But it is amazing that I made it into my 40s without understanding this.
That was Dara Horn. If you'd like to hear the full interview, please go to the link in the description and it'll take you to the rest of the interview. Thank you again for listening, my sweetest friends. Until next week, take care of yourselves and sei gesund.